You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
In 1994, Professor Mark Umbreit founded the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking. It's a center that serves as an international resource in support of restorative dialogue, practice, research, and training. Here's more of our conversation on the center's work. When you arrange a meeting between a victim's family and the person convicted of that person's murder, what do you usually see takes place? You mentioned there are a lot of questions. The question immediately that would come to mind is why? But what happens during this interaction?
Well, let me back up just a little bit, because restorative justice as a movement globally, nationally, regionally in this state, most cases are not murder. Thousands of cases throughout this country and the world are common crime, which is property crime, which is burglaries, thefts, minor assaults, vandalism. And the common question there is, why me? And did you have any idea of, the terror you caused in our lives and the hassle and all that? On the other hand, since the early 90s, there's been a small but growing number of victims of the worst crimes imaginable that in the early 70s, I never would have imagined would ever want any kind of victim-offender dialogue. They have come to people like myself and a growing number of others now and said, why not me? If this can be helpful to burglary victims, what about me? My son was murdered, or my daughter was kidnapped and raped and murdered. From the moment it's happened, I've wanted to meet the person who did it and ask them, why? Did you have any idea of the precious child that you killed? You killed a part of me. There's many reasons why, and these are victim-initiated, by the way. It's not like referrals by the criminal justice process. In property offenses, courts refer those cases, probation departments, and sometimes police departments. In severe violence, those are initiated years later, sometimes as many as 8 to even 30 years later. Victims survivors have lived with this trauma all their lives, in their head believing they have closure. They forgave, even some people believe that. And yet they've had this haunting sense, this tremendous trauma within them. And they initiate the process. For my healing, I need to meet the source of my trauma. That requires a tremendous amount of preparation, anywhere from 4 to 6 months. A recent case that's highlighted in a recent film that's been airing, it took over 2 years of preparation, a vicious murder that occurred in St. Paul here many, many, many years ago.
Let's talk about the film you just mentioned.
The film, it's got an unusual name. It's called On Being with the Energy of Forgiveness, Lessons from Former Enemies in Restorative Dialogue. This is a totally different way of looking at forgiveness. There are hundreds and hundreds of films on forgiveness, thousands of articles, all of which are good in their own way, but they're primarily looking more intellectually, conceptually, at forgiveness and different ways of dealing with it. What I have witnessed really from the late 70s to this date on cases I've witnessed or been part of or I've facilitated, I never could put words to, and in more recent years I have been able to. I had witnessed shifts in the attitude, the vibes, something going on that were remarkable. I would see some of the angriest victims, sometimes law enforcement officers, state troopers in uniform, come into sessions with offenders who jumped them or wrestled for their gun as they're trying to be arrested. And I would see a shift from incredible anger and questioning to a different tone of voice, bending over, more directly speaking to usually a young offender. I saw self-disclosure, even police officers saying, when I was your age, I did some of this stupid stuff. And I don't want to see you destroy your life. And that happens at different levels, from sort of minor to more dramatic than you could imagine. I mean, I have been in cases, and some of these have been shown on different TV stations, where a parent of a murdered child, after all this time, and after a 4-hour session with the person who killed their daughter, ends up actually hugging the offender, which is up here hard to imagine. But that's the words I put to that at this point in my research and my practice and my life. It's a shift in energy. That's a term I used to think was flaky, decades ago. I don't. Energy is interesting because as long as it's a commodity with price and economics connected to it, no problem talking about it. But talking about energy the way Albert Einstein did, the great physicist of the last century, who said the more he learned of physics, the more he believed in metaphysics, the spiritual, the energy that connects us all. That's what the film is about. It's about two cases of parents of murdered children who met the offender, both in this state. Actually, one is a child whose father was murdered. That's a case I facilitated from St. Paul. Another case is a parent of murdered children from North Minneapolis, which I didn't facilitate it, but I helped train some of the people and worked with the project. It also includes two community cases. One from the Phillips community of conflict between Somalis and Native Americans, and then a case from the Milwaukee area of clergy sex abuse, where the form of restorative dialogue called the circle process, the talking circle, which comes out of the wisdom of the indigenous people of this region, of this nation, many tribal people, Ojibwa, Lakota, Dakota, who have taught us and who have been some of our greatest teachers, frankly. And the restorative justice movement is, there's many ways of talking about it, but I want to give you a very short version. I mean, it's a very different way of understanding and responding to crime. Crime is not simply a violation of codes or law. That's in the background. But crime is fundamentally a violation of people and communities. And in restorative justice, crime is viewed as a wound within the community. It's kind of like a public health perspective. And justice requires accountability and healing. Healing for all. Holding offenders accountable, not just punishment for punishment's sake at costly levels, but where offenders are held directly accountable for the people they stole from, the people or communities they hurt, in the most realistic ways possible. But they're also offered ways of healing within their own lives and with their families. So it really cuts through the normal liberal stuff or conservative stuff. It's a new path. And it raises the level of victims to heights that don't happen in our conventional criminal justice system. Restorative justice is a victim-centered approach. It starts with the reality. People have been hurt, communities and families. It is not just laws. And victims need to be respected, listened to, invited into the process, not just on advisory boards or spectators. But there are some communities here in Minnesota and other parts of the country where victims and victimized communities are part of sentencing circles to allow their input, and they decide together what's the best way of holding this offender accountable that's meaningful to the community, meaningful to the victim, and that's recommended to the judge.
When Access Minnesota continues, we hear more about University of Minnesota professor Mark Umbreit's work in restorative justice.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.